The first thing you learn when you spend 50 years carving mahogany and oak is that wood never lies. It tells you exactly where it's weak, where the rot has started, and where it's destined to break. People, on the other hand, are much harder to read. They can coat themselves in a fine veneer of love and respect, polished to a high shine, while the core underneath is turning to sawdust. My name is Frank Miller. I'm 73 years old, and for most of those years, I thought I knew how to spot a flaw in a person's character as easily as a knot in a plank of cedar. I was wrong. I spent 3 years living under the same roof as a man who was calculating the exact dollar value of my expiration date, and I didn't suspect a thing until the day I found the ledger hidden beneath the dust of my own life. I was sitting in my armchair that Tuesday, the one I'd built for Mary 40 years ago. My hands were shaking just a tremor, the kind that comes with 7 decades of hard labor, and I was nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee. The house was quiet, that heavy, oppressive kind of quiet that only exists when you're the only one left in a home that used to be full of laughter. My daughter, Sarah, was at the elementary school where she teaches, and her husband, Michael, was supposedly at his accounting firm. I say supposedly because, looking back, that was the first of many lies I chose to believe. I decided to do something productive. I felt like a guest in my own skin lately, a ghost haunting the hallways of a house I had built with my own 2 hands. Sarah had insisted I move in after Mary passed, telling me she couldn't bear the thought of me being alone in that big, empty farmhouse. At the time, it felt like a mercy. Now, it felt like a cage. My sheets needed changing, and being the stubborn old man I am, I didn't want to wait for Sarah to come home and do it for me. I wanted to feel useful, even if it was just the simple act of making a bed. I walked down the hallway to the master suite. It felt wrong, stepping into their space, but the linen closet was inside their large walk-in. I opened the door, the smell of Michael's expensive cologne hitting me like a physical weight. He was a man who liked the finer things he couldn't quite afford on an accountant's salary, though I never said that out loud. As I reached for the fresh percale sheets, my eyes caught a glimpse of something odd. The corner of their heavy mattress was hiked up just an inch, as if someone had shoved a bulky envelope underneath in a hurry. In my day, you didn't touch things that weren't yours, but there was a coldness in the air that afternoon, a sudden, sharp intuition that pricked at the back of my neck. I set the sheets down. My heart started to thud against my ribs, a slow, rhythmic warning. I reached out and lifted the edge of the mattress. There, tucked away like a shameful secret, was a cheap, brown spiral notebook. Its edges were frayed, the cover stained with what looked like coffee rings. I shouldn't have opened it. I should have walked away and kept the illusion of my happy family intact. But I didn't. I sat on the edge of their bed, my breath coming in shallow hitches, and I flipped to the first page. At first it looked like standard accounting columns of numbers, dates, and percentages. But as I turned the pages, the entries shifted from business to personal. And then, I saw my name. October 12th. The old man's medication increased by $80 this month. At this rate, the grocery budget is being cannibalized by his special diet. Sarah won't listen. She thinks he's an asset. He's a liability. November 5th. Another doctor's visit. $200 copay. That's money that should be going toward the Florida land deposit. He's breathing away our future. December 1st. He's costing us approximately $1,100 a month in direct expenses. Indirectly, the lost opportunity cost of this house is astronomical. If he wasn't occupying the suite, we could be looking at a total liquidation. I felt a wave of nausea so potent I had to lean forward and put my head between my knees. Michael didn't see me as a father-in-law. He didn't even see me as a human being. I was a row on a spreadsheet. I was a cost that needed to be mitigated. But it got worse. I flipped further, my hands trembling so violently the paper rattled. January 14th. Consulted with Miller and Associates. Ironic name. Confirmed the deed structure. Sarah is the sole heir. Upon Frank's passing, the transfer is instantaneous. No probate if the paperwork I helped him sign last year holds up. The house is valued at $650K in this market. February 22nd. Sarah is getting sentimental again, talking about long-term care options for when he gets worse. I told her we can't afford a facility. The only way out of this financial hole is for nature to take its course. Hopefully, nature has a sense of urgency. I closed the notebook, my eyes burning. This was the man I sat across from every night at dinner. This was the man who smiled at me and asked how my old bones were feeling while he was secretly praying for them to turn to dust. I felt a sudden, sharp sense of betrayal that cut deeper than any tool I'd ever used in the shop. I had given them everything. I had sold my farmhouse and given Sarah the down payment for this place. I had built the deck, the kitchen cabinets, the very bed I was sitting on, and Michael was sitting there, counting the days until I was gone so he could trade my life for a piece of land in Florida. But then, I saw the most recent entry. It was dated just yesterday. April 16th. The life insurance policy is active. $500,000. Sarah signed the secondary forms without reading the fine print. Bless her heart. She trusts me implicitly. Now, we just wait. The doctor mentioned his heart is unstable. A sudden shock, a fall, a mistake with the dosage. It wouldn't take much. And then, finally, we can start living. I heard the front door click open. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my system. I didn't have time to process the horror of what I'd just read, the fact that my son-in-law was contemplating my accidental death. I heard footsteps in the foyer. Michael. He was home early. I shoved the notebook back under the mattress, trying to align it exactly as I'd found it. My movements were clumsy, my joints stiff with age and terror. I grabbed the sheets from the floor just as the bedroom door swung open. Michael stood there, his silk tie loosened, his leather briefcase in hand. He stopped dead when he saw me. His eyes, usually so calculated and cool, flickered with something I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't surprise. It was a predator's instinct. "Frank," he said, his voice dropping into that smooth, practiced tone he used to close deals. "What are you doing in our room?" I clutched the sheets to my chest like a shield. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I just wanted to change my sheets, Michael. I knew they were in here. I didn't want to bother Sarah. Michael didn't move. He scanned the room, his gaze lingering on the bed, then shifting to my face. He took a step toward me, and for the first time in my life, I felt a genuine, primitive fear of another human being. He was younger, stronger, and according to that notebook, he was very, very hungry for a life I was still using. "You look pale, Frank," Michael said, a thin, oily smile spreading across his face. "Is your heart acting up again? Maybe you should sit down. In fact, maybe you should let me get you your medicine." I looked at him, and for a split second, the veneer slipped. I didn't see the successful accountant. I saw a man who had already buried me in his mind. I realized then that I couldn't just tell Sarah. She loved him. She would think I was confused, that I was deteriorating, just like he'd written. I was alone in this house with a man who wanted me dead, and he had just realized that I might know his secret. "I'm fine," I managed to choke out, stepping past him. I'll go lie down." As I walked down the hallway, I felt his eyes on my back. I didn't know it yet, but that was the last moment of peace I would ever have in that house. Because as I reached my door, I heard the unmistakable sound of the mattress being moved. Michael was checking. He was checking to see if his secret was still safe. I went into my room and locked the door, a thing I had never done in Sarah's house. I sat on my bed, staring at the medicine bottle on my nightstand, the little white pills that were supposed to keep me alive. I looked at them, and a terrifying thought took root in my mind. Had he already started? Was the accident already in motion? I reached for the bottle, my hand shaking so hard I nearly dropped it, and that's when I noticed something. The seal on the cap looked slightly mangled, as if it had been forced. I realized then that I wasn't just a burden to Michael anymore. I was a witness, and in Michael's world, witnesses didn't last very long. I didn't know what happened next would change everything, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to die quietly in my sleep, just to make his balance sheet look better. The click of the lock felt like the loudest sound I'd ever made. I stood there, pressed against the solid oak door, a door I'd hung myself when we moved in, listening to the silence on the other side. My heart was a frantic drum in my ears. I could almost picture Michael standing just inches away, his head cocked, eyes narrowed, wondering exactly how much of his soul I'd just glimpsed under that mattress. I stared at the medicine bottle in my hand. The orange plastic felt oily, tainted. I'd been taking these pills for 3 years, trusting the man who picked them up from the pharmacy as if he were my own flesh and blood. Now, the very thought of swallowing one made my throat constrict. I realized then that the first mistake I made wasn't opening that notebook. It was 3 years ago, when I allowed my grief for Mary to blind me to the man my daughter had married. When Mary passed, the world lost its color. We'd been married for 45 years. She was the one who kept the books for my furniture business, the one who knew exactly how much sawdust was in my lungs and how much love was in my heart. When she left, the farmhouse felt like a mausoleum. Sarah, bless her heart, saw me drowning. She and Michael had just bought this place, a sprawling, modern thing in the Chicago suburbs that lacked the soul of my workshop but had plenty of potential. They invited me to move in, and in my weakness I said yes. "It's for the best, Dad," Sarah had told me, her eyes wet with worry. "We have the space, and Michael is so good with finances. He can help you manage the sale of the farm. You won't have to worry about a thing." I should have known then. Not worrying about a thing is just another way of saying handing over the keys to your life. I sold the farm, the land my father had cleared, the workshop where I'd spent my best years, and handed the proceeds to Michael to invest for my long-term care. I thought I was being a good father, helping my daughter and her husband get a head start while securing my own future. I didn't realize I was just funding my own execution. I sat down on my bed, the room feeling smaller than it had 10 minutes ago. I needed to think. I needed to look back and see the signs I'd missed, because once you see the rot, you realize it's been there for a long time. The legal paperwork. Last year, Michael brought home a stack of documents. He told me it was just to simplify the estate, a way to ensure Sarah wouldn't have to deal with red tape if I got sick. I trusted him. I signed where he pointed. I didn't read the fine print. I didn't see the power of attorney or the life insurance writers. The Florida obsession. For months, Michael had been obsessed with a development opportunity in the Gulf. He'd talk about it at dinner until Sarah's eyes went dull. He needed $300,000 for the buy-in. I remember him looking at me across the table, his gaze lingering just a second too long on my shaking hands. The silent conversations. I'd caught them whispering in the kitchen late at night. Every time I entered the room, the air would turn cold, and Michael would immediately pivot to asking me about my favorite baseball team. I thought they were worried about my health. I didn't know they were worried about my longevity. I looked at the medicine bottle again. My blood pressure was high, dangerously so if I didn't stay on the regimen. But what was in these capsules now? Michael was an accountant. He was precise. He wouldn't just poison me. No, he'd modify the dose, just like the notebook said. A little extra here, a missed dose there, until my heart simply gave up under the strain. It would look like a natural progression of age, the perfect crime for a man who lived by the numbers. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't stay in that room forever. If I stayed hidden, I was admitting I knew. I had to go back out there. I had to play the part of the doddering, grateful old man. I had to be the cost Michael was so desperate to cut. I took a deep breath, slipped the medicine bottle into my pocket, and unlocked the door. The hallway was empty, but the house felt different. The shadows seemed longer, the air thicker. I walked toward the kitchen, my footsteps heavy on the hardwood. I found Michael at the island, pouring a glass of scotch. He didn't turn around when I entered. "You took a long time in your room, Frank," he said, his back still to me. "Everything okay?" "Just tired, Michael," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Think I'll skip dinner and just have some tea?" "Nonsense," he said, turning around. He held out the glass of scotch toward me, a gesture of peace that felt like a threat. "Sarah's making that roast you like. You need your strength. You've been looking fragile lately." He used that word, fragile, like I was a piece of glass he was waiting to drop. He walked toward me, his movements fluid and confident. He reached out and adjusted the collar of my flannel shirt, his fingers brushing against my neck. I had to fight the urge to flinch. "We really do worry about you, Frank," he whispered, his eyes locked on mine. "You know that, don't you? Sarah and I, we want what's best for you. Always." I looked into his eyes and saw the ledger. I saw the $500,000 policy. I saw the land in Florida. "I know, Michael," I said, forcing a smile. "I don't know what I'd do without you two." He patted my shoulder, a heavy, lingering touch, and walked past me into the living room. I stood in the kitchen, trembling. I knew I couldn't just tell Sarah. She was the one light in my world, and Michael had spent years making sure he was the only thing holding that light up. If I told her her husband was a monster, she'd think the dementia Michael had been subtly hinting at was finally taking hold. He'd been laying the groundwork for months, making little comments about my forgetfulness whenever I misplaced my glasses or forgot a name. I was being gaslit in my own home, and I hadn't even noticed. That night, dinner was an exercise in pure psychological warfare. Sarah was her usual self, bright, talkative, telling me about a student who had finally mastered long division. Michael was the perfect husband, leaning in, laughing at the right moments, and occasionally glancing at me with a look of feigned concern. "Dad, you haven't touched your water," Sarah said, pointing to the glass Michael had filled for me. "Not thirsty, honey," I said. "You have to stay hydrated, Frank," Michael added, his voice smooth as silk. "Especially with those new pills the doctor prescribed. They can be hard on the system if you don't drink enough." My stomach did a slow roll. New pills? The doctor hadn't changed my prescription in 6 months. I looked at Michael, and for a split second, the mask slipped. There was a challenge in his eyes. He was daring me to question him. He was testing to see if I'd read the notebook, or if I was just having another confused day. I realized then that Michael's desperation went deeper than just the Florida land. A few days later, while they were both out, I did something I'm not proud of. I went into Michael's home office. I'd always stayed out of there. It was his sanctuary, the place where he made the magic happen for our finances. But I needed to know why a man with a steady job was so hungry for my death. I didn't find a notebook this time. I found a folder marked Project Heron. It took me an hour to wade through the jargon, but once I did, the picture was horrifyingly clear. Michael hadn't just invested my farm money. He had lost it, every cent. He'd put it into a high-risk real estate trust that had collapsed 3 months ago. He was broke. Worse than broke, he had used Sarah's name as a co-signer on a series of bridge loans to keep the investment afloat. If the lenders called in the debt, they wouldn't just lose the Florida dream. They'd lose this house. They'd lose everything. Except, of course, for the $500,000 that would come to Sarah upon my accidental passing. I sat back in his leather chair, the weight of the discovery pressing the air from my lungs. Michael wasn't just a greedy man. He was a desperate one. And a desperate man is the most dangerous animal on earth. He didn't just want me dead. He needed me dead to save his own skin. I heard the garage door rumble open. They were home. I scrambled to put the folder back, my heart racing. I barely made it out of the office and into the hallway before the front door opened. "Dad, you in here?" Sarah's voice called out. "In the hall, honey," I said, trying to steady my breathing. Michael came in behind her, his eyes immediately darting to his office door. He looked at me, then at the door, then back at me. The air in the hallway felt like it was charged with electricity. He knew. He didn't have proof, but he knew I'd been digging. "You look a little winded, Frank," Michael said, his voice dropping an octave. "Maybe the stairs are getting to be too much for you. We should probably talk about moving your things down to the basement guest room. It's safer. No stairs to worry about." The basement, where the windows were small and the walls were concrete, where no one would hear me if I fell. "I like my room, Michael," I said, my voice hardening. "I like the view." "Views can be deceiving," Michael replied, stepping closer until he was looming over me. "Sometimes it's better to be on solid ground. Before you have a fall you can't get up from." That night, as I lay in the dark, I realized that the waiting phase of Michael's plan was over. He was moving into the execution phase. I checked the medicine bottle again. Under the light of a small flashlight, I saw it, a tiny bit of white powder clinging to the rim of the cap. He wasn't just switching the pills anymore. He was crushing them, adding them to my food, my drinks, my life. I was being poisoned in the one place I was supposed to be safe, by the man my daughter loved. I knew I had to act, but I was a 73-year-old man against a master manipulator. I needed a plan. I needed an ally. But as I listened to the floorboards creak outside my door, Michael, pacing, watching, waiting, I realized the most terrifying thing of all. He wasn't waiting for me to die anymore. He was deciding which accident would be the easiest to explain to the coroner. And as the door handle to my room slowly, silently began to turn, I realized that tomorrow might be a day I wouldn't live to see. The brass handle of my bedroom door continued its slow, agonized rotation. In the dark, the sound was like a bone snapping in slow motion. I didn't breathe. I lay there, stiff as a board of Killine dried hickory, my eyes squeezed shut. I did what I used to do back in the day when I worked on delicate inlay. I slowed my heart by sheer force of will. I made myself part of the furniture. The door creaked open just an inch. A sliver of light from the hallway stretched across the hardwood floor, climbing up the foot of my bed. I could feel him standing there. The air in the room changed, growing heavy with the scent of scotch and something sharper, the metallic tang of pure, unadulterated malice. I felt his gaze on me, a physical weight pressing down on my chest. He wasn't there to tuck me in. He was studying me, checking for the rise and fall of my shoulders, perhaps wondering if the adjustments he'd made to my evening tea were already taking hold. After what felt like an eternity, the door clicked shut. The lock didn't engage, but I heard his footsteps retreat down the hall, light and rhythmic. He was whistling. A soft, tuneless sound that made the hair on my arm stand up. I stayed awake until the sun began to bleed through the curtains, realizing that I was no longer living in a home. I was living in a blind. And the hunter was getting impatient. The next morning, the house was filled with the smell of blueberry pancakes. It was a family Saturday, a tradition Michael had started shortly after I moved in. Usually, it was a time of forced cheer, but today it felt like a funeral brunch. "Morning, Dad," Sarah chirped as I shuffled into the kitchen. She looked tired, the dark circles under her eyes a testament to the stress Michael was subtly pouring into our lives. "Michael made your favorite. Extra syrup, just the way you like it." Michael was standing at the griddle, looking like a page out of a catalog, crisp apron, perfectly groomed hair, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sit down, Frank, you need your calories. You were tossing and turning quite a bit last night. I heard you through the walls. Are the night terrors coming back?" He said it loudly enough for Sarah to hear. I saw her hand pause over her coffee mug, her brow furrowed, that look of pity starting to drown out the warmth I used to see there. This was his primary weapon, the slow, methodical erosion of my credibility. "I slept fine, Michael," I said, sliding into my chair. "Must have been the wind you heard." "The wind doesn't groan, Frank," Michael said, sliding a plate of pancakes in front of me. He leaned in, his voice dropping just enough so Sarah wouldn't catch the edge. "And it doesn't lock its door from the inside. We're family, remember? There shouldn't be any secrets between us." I looked down at the pancakes. They were golden brown, glistening with syrup, and in the center of the top one, there was a tiny, pressed invisible dusting of white. Most people would have thought it was powdered sugar, but I'd spent 40 years looking for imperfections in grain. This wasn't sugar. It was too crystalline, too flat. "Actually," I said, pushing the plate toward him, "I think I'll have what you're having, Michael. That omelet looks delicious. My stomach is a bit sour this morning for all that sugar." The mask didn't break, but the muscle in Michael's jaw twitched. "Oh, Frank, don't be difficult. Sarah spent 20 minutes picking out these blueberries for you." "It's okay, Michael," Sarah said, her voice small. "If he's not feeling up to it, he's not feeling up to it. Dad, are you sure you're okay? Michael mentioned you've been acting a bit paranoid lately. Asking about bank statements? Looking through his office?" My heart sank. He'd already turned her. He'd taken my curiosity and framed it as a symptom of a mind in decline. "I was just looking for the farm papers, honey," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I wanted to see the closing costs again, just to have my ducks in a row." "Michael already took care of all that, Dad," she said, reaching across the table to pat my hand. Her touch felt like a goodbye. "He's been so good about managing everything so you don't have to. Why don't you go lie down after breakfast? You look a bit confused." Confused. That word was a dagger. I looked at Michael, and he gave me a slow, deliberate wink. He had me boxed in. If I spoke the truth, I was crazy. If I stayed silent, I was dead. I needed to understand exactly how Michael had pulled this off. I needed to know what happened to the farm money. That afternoon, while Sarah was out grocery shopping and Michael was supposedly running errands, which I now knew meant meeting with his creditors or checking on his Florida pipe dream, I went back to the one place I knew he kept his real self hidden, the basement. Not the guest room he wanted to move me into the workshop. It was a small corner of the basement I'd reclaimed, filled with my old tools. Michael hated it down there. He said the sawdust was bad for his lungs. It was the only place in the house I felt like myself. I sat at my workbench, running my thumb over the blade of a smoothing plane. I remembered what Mary used to say, "Frank, when a joint doesn't fit, don't force it. Look for the shim." The shim, in this case, was Michael's past. I'd always known he came from new money that had dried up, but Sarah had been so enchanted by his polish that we never dug deep. I began to look through the old crates of my business records I'd moved from the farm. Tucked inside a ledger from 1998, I found a letter Mary had written, but never sent. She was always the better judge of character. "Frank," the letter began, "I didn't want to worry you while the furniture contract was so heavy, but I did some checking on that boy Sarah is seeing. Michael Salazar didn't just leave his last firm in Boston. He was asked to exit. There was something about a client's trust fund and a misunderstanding with the ledger. Sarah won't hear a word against him, but promise me, if I'm not around, you'll keep the farm in your name only. He's a man who builds houses on other people's foundations." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp basement air. Mary knew. Even back then, she saw the rot, and I, in my grief, had ignored the very foundation she'd tried to protect. But there was more. I noticed a floorboard near my workbench that looked off. It was a piece of white oak I'd laid myself, but the nails were seated differently. Someone had been down here. Someone who didn't know how to properly seat a finishing nail. I grabbed a crowbar and pried it up. Underneath wasn't a stash of money or a weapon. It was a second notebook, not a spiral one this time, but a high-end, leather-bound journal. It was Michael's shadow ledger. I opened it and felt the world tilt. It wasn't just my money he'd lost. He had been skimming from Sarah's pension for years. He'd forged her signature on a second mortgage for the house we were currently standing in. But the entry that stopped my heart was dated 3 weeks ago. The Miller property in Chicago is the only collateral left. If the old man doesn't pass by June, the bank will start the foreclosure process on this house. Sarah will lose everything. In a way, I'm doing this for her. He's lived his life. She deserves to keep hers. The dosage needs to be more consistent. He's skipping the morning tea. I'll have to move to the evening scotch. He never refuses a drink with the son he never had. I realized then that Michael had a timeline. June. That was only 6 weeks away. He wasn't just waiting for a natural accident. He was on a deadline. If I didn't die by June, his entire house of cards would come crashing down, and he'd take Sarah with him. Suddenly, I heard the basement door creak open at the top of the stairs. "Frank," Michael's voice echoed down the concrete steps. It was devoid of its usual warmth. It was flat, cold, and dangerously close. "I thought I told you the stairs were getting too dangerous for you. What are you doing down there in the dark?" I shoved the leather journal into the waistband of my trousers and covered it with my flannel shirt. I grabbed a piece of sandpaper and started rubbing a block of wood with a ferocity I didn't know I still possessed. "Just cleaning my tools, Michael," I called back, my voice remarkably steady. A man's got to keep his edge. I watched his shoes appear on the stairs, then his legs, then that suit that cost more than my first car. He stood at the bottom of the steps, his eyes scanning the room like a searchlight. He looked at the floorboard I'd just pried up. I'd put it back, but I knew I hadn't been fast enough to hide the scuff marks. Michael walked over to me. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, breathing, the scent of expensive tobacco and desperation rolling off him. He reached out and picked up a small wood chisel from my bench. He tested the edge with his thumb, drawing a tiny bead of blood. "It's sharp," Michael whispered, "almost as sharp as you think you are." He looked at the floorboard, then back at me. A slow, terrifying smile spread across his face. "You know, Frank, I've been thinking about what you said, about having your ducks in a row. It's important to have everything settled, which is why I've scheduled a special appointment for us on Monday, a specialist, to help with the memory issues. I don't need a specialist, Michael. Sarah thinks you do, he replied, his voice leaning hard on her name. And what Sarah wants, Sarah gets. We're going to take a little drive, just the two of us, to a clinic, out in the country. It's very private, very secure. He leaned in close, the chisel still in his hand, the tip of it pointing toward my throat. Don't worry, Frank. By the time we get back, you won't have to worry about notebooks or floorboards ever again. You won't have to worry about anything at all. He turned and headed back up the stairs, leaving me in the dark. I stood there, the leather journal pressing into my spine, realizing that I had just been given my execution date, Monday. I had 48 hours to figure out how to dismantle a monster before he dismantled me. I looked at my tools, the saws and the planes, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a builder. And I was going to build Michael a trap so perfect, he wouldn't even realize he was in it until the door clicked shut. But as I heard him locking the basement door from the outside, trapping me in my own workshop, I realized I had overlooked one very important detail. Michael hadn't just losing the money. He had been practicing. And as I looked at the small, high window of the basement, I saw the silhouette of a man holding a heavy iron pipe, waiting for the shadows to get just a little bit longer. The basement was a tomb of sawdust and secrets. For 3 hours, I sat in the dark, the leather journal tucked into my waistband, listening to the muffled sounds of a life I was no longer allowed to lead. I heard the television upstairs, the evening news, the weather report, the mundane sounds of a happy home. Every creak of the floorboards above me was a reminder that Michael was pacing, watching, and waiting for the silence of the grave to take hold of his father-in-law. I looked at the high, narrow basement window. The silhouette I'd seen the man with the pipe had vanished into the shadows of the overgrown hydrangeas, but the message remained. I am everywhere, Frank. You are nowhere. But Michael had made a fundamental mistake. He forgot that a man who spends half a century building things knows exactly how to take them apart. He thought a locked door would keep me contained. He didn't realize that to a carpenter, a door is just a series of hinges and a strike plate waiting to be manipulated. I didn't need a key. I reached for my specialized toolkit, the one Mary bought me for our 30th anniversary. I felt for the slim, carbon steel putty knife and a heavy-duty screwdriver. I didn't make a sound. I worked by touch, the way I used to sand mahogany until it felt like skin. I didn't try to pick the lock. Michael would notice that. Instead, I went for the hinge pins. It took 40 minutes of patient, agonizingly slow work, but eventually, the 3 steel pins slid out like butter. I caught the door as it listed, leaning it back against the frame. I stepped into the hallway, a shadow among shadows. The house was dark now. Sarah was likely asleep, exhausted by the emotional weight of managing her declining father. Michael, however, was in his study. I could see the light bleeding out from under the door. I crept closer, my socks silencing my footsteps on the hardwood. I didn't know it yet, but the conversation I was about to overhear would be the final nail in the coffin of my mercy. Yes, it's all set, I heard Michael whisper. His voice was different, no longer the polished professional, but raw and desperate. The clinic in Oak Haven. It's a 3-hour drive. Plenty of winding roads, no guardrails. If a car goes over the edge of the Blackwood ravine, they won't find the wreckage until the spring thaw. It's an easy narrative. Confused. Old man grabs the wheel. Tragic accident. I'll be the grieving hero who tried to save him. A pause. Then a cold, dry chuckle that made my skin crawl. Of course Sarah will be taken care of. Once the American Life payout clears, we'll be debt-free. She'll thank me eventually. She's too soft for the real world, but she's a fast learner when it comes to spending money. Just make sure the paperwork for the medical emergency is dated Friday. We need a paper trail showing he was already losing his grip. I leaned against the wall, my knees nearly buckling. He wasn't just planning a fall in the bathroom. He was planning a high-speed execution. He was going to drive me into a ravine and walk away as the victim. I retreated to the basement, replaced the door, and slid the hinge pins back into place. I sat on my workbench and stared at my hands. They weren't shaking anymore. They were steady. For the first time in months, the tremor was gone, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. Michael thought he was playing a game of numbers. He didn't realize I was playing a game of survival. The next morning, Sunday, the atmosphere was thick enough to choke on. Michael was overly attentive, almost manic. He made coffee, brought me the Sunday paper, and kept touching my shoulder, his fingers lingering like a brand. "Big day tomorrow, Frank," he said, his smile tight. "The specialist in Oak Haven is the best. He's going to help you find your way back to us. No more confusion. No more locking doors." "I'm looking forward to it, Michael," I said. I looked him dead in the eye, and for a second, I saw a flicker of doubt in his gaze. "I'm looking forward to everything being settled." Sarah walked in then, her eyes red and puffy. She looked like she'd been crying all night. "Dad, are you sure you're okay with the drive? It's a long way." "I'm fine, honey," I said, reaching out to squeeze her hand. I wanted to tell her. I wanted to scream the truth, to show her the journal, to show her the medicine bottle. But I knew Michael had spent months poisoning her mind against me. If I spoke now, he'd simply point to my agitation as proof I needed to be committed. Or worse, he'd accelerate the accident to today. I had to wait. I had to let him lead me into the trap, because a trap only works if the predator thinks he's the one setting it. The escalation began after lunch. Michael started prepping for the trip. He took my suitcase, the one I'd had since my honeymoon, and began packing it. He wasn't packing for a weekend at a clinic. He was packing things I wouldn't need in a ravine. He was throwing in old photos of Mary, my favorite wood-carving knife, and my birth certificate. He was cleaning out my life. "You won't need these where you're going, Frank," he said, his back to me as he folded a shirt. "But it's good to have them close, for the memories." "You're very thorough, Michael," I said. He turned around, and the mask was gone. The smile was just a baring of teeth now. "I have to be. People like you. You're a drain, Frank. You're a leak in a boat that was already taking on water. I'm just plugging the hole." He walked toward me, hovering just inches from my face. "Do you know what the worst part is? Sarah actually believes you're sick. She looks at you and sees a broken machine. She's already mourned you. Tomorrow is just a formality." I felt a surge of rage so powerful I almost swung at him, but I held it back. I needed him confident. I needed him to think I was the broken machine he described. "I know what you're doing, Michael," I whispered. He laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "It doesn't matter if you know. Who are you going to tell? The police? An old man with a history of confusion and paranoia reporting his successful accountant's son-in-law? They'll have you in a padded room before the sun sets. And Sarah? She'll be the one signing the commitment papers. I've already made sure of that." He walked out, leaving me in the living room. I looked out the window and saw a car I didn't recognize idling at the end of the driveway. It was a dark sedan with tinted windows. Michael's associate, the man with the pipe. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting Michael. He had help. This was bigger than a family dispute. This was a coordinated liquidation of my life. That night, the house was silent. I didn't sleep. I spent the hours preparing. I took the leather journal and the medicine bottle and hid them in a hollowed-out block of oak in my workshop, a place Michael would never think to look. Then, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to the old safe in the basement, the one I'd kept since my business days. Michael didn't have the combination. Inside, tucked behind some old tax returns, was a small, high-definition digital recorder Joe had given me years ago when I complained about forgetting client requests. I tested the battery. Full. I tested the microphone. Sharp enough to hear a pin drop. I taped it to the underside of the passenger seat in Michael's SUV. If we were going for a drive to a ravine, I wanted every word of our last conversation recorded. As I was finishing, I heard a sound from the driveway. I peered through the basement window. Michael was out there, standing by the SUV. He was tampering with the passenger side seatbelt. He was making sure that if the car went over a cliff, I wouldn't be able to get out. He was ensuring my seatbelt would jam upon impact. My blood ran cold. He wasn't just planning an accident. He was planning a horror movie. I went back to my room and waited for morning. When the sun finally rose, It was a gray, miserable day. The kind of day that looks like an ending. "Time to go, Frank," Michael said, knocking on my door at 6 a.m. His voice was bright, cheerful, the sound of a man who had already spent the insurance money in his head. Sarah was in the kitchen, her face pale. She hugged me, and she didn't let go for a long time. "I love you, Dad, please. Please listen to the doctors. We just want you back." "I love you too, Sarah," I said, my voice breaking. "No matter what happens, remember that. I did everything for you." Michael ushered me into the car. He slammed the door, and the sound was like a gavel coming down. As we pulled out of the driveway, I saw the dark sedan pull out behind us. We drove in silence for the first hour. Michael was focused on the road, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. As we hit the outskirts of the city and began the climb into the mountains, the road narrowed. The fog began to roll in, thick and white, obscuring the world. "You know, Frank," Michael said suddenly, his voice cracking the silence, "I really did try to like you. But you're just so heavy. You take up so much space. And Sarah, she's better off without the burden of your past." "Is that why you're taking me to Blackwood Ravine, Michael?" I asked. My voice was calm, almost bored. The car swerved slightly. Michael's head snapped toward me. "How do you know about the ravine?" "I know everything, Michael. I know about Project Heron. I know about the skimming. I know about the $500,000 policy. And I know that the man in the dark sedan behind us is waiting for you to nudge me over the edge." Michael's face went through a terrifying transformation. The veneer didn't just crack, it shattered. He let out a low, guttural growl and floored the accelerator. The SUV surged forward, the engine roaring as we climbed higher into the mist. "It doesn't matter what you know," Michael screamed, his eyes wide and wild. "You're dead anyway. By the time anyone finds that recorder you probably hid, I'll be halfway to Florida with Sarah. You think you're smart? You're just a rotting piece of wood, Frank. And today, I'm the one with the saw." He steered the car toward a sharp, unprotected curve where the road vanished into a white abyss. He reached over and yanked the steering wheel toward the cliffside, his face contorted in a mask of pure, murderous joy. "Goodbye, Frank." The car veered toward the edge. I looked out the window and saw the drop 100 feet of nothingness. But Michael had forgotten one thing. He had tampered with my seatbelt, but he hadn't checked his own. What happened next was a blur of metal and glass. But it was the one thing Michael hadn't calculated, the one variable that changes every equation. And as the car left the pavement, I realized that I hadn't just recorded his confession. I had prepared the car for a very different kind of accident. The sound of the tires leaving the pavement was a high-pitched scream that echoed the one trapped in my throat. For a heartbeat, the world went weightless. Gravity vanished, replaced by the sickening lurch of the SUV tilting toward the white abyss of the ravine. I saw Michael's face, a twisted mask of triumph, his eyes wide and bloodshot, fixed on the empty space where the road used to be. He was laughing, a sound so hollow it made the roaring wind outside seem warm. "But I'm a carpenter. I know how to build things to withstand pressure, and I know exactly how to make a structure fail when the right pivot point is removed." In the 3 minutes before we left the house, while Michael was busy comforting a weeping Sarah in the kitchen, I hadn't just been standing by the car. I had been under it. I didn't need to cut the brakes that would be too obvious, too easy for a coroner to find. Instead, I had reached into the wheel well and adjusted a simple tensioner on the emergency brake cable. And more importantly, I had shoved a small, wedge-shaped shim of ironwood, the hardest wood on earth, into the track of the driver's side door. Michael's plan required him to jump. He needed to steer the car toward the edge, wait until the very last second, and roll out onto the soft shoulder while I, trapped by a jammed seatbelt, plunged into the rocks below. It was a classic coward's move. As the car veered toward the cliff, Michael's hand flew to his door handle. He yanked it with the strength of a man who suddenly realized he was about to die. Nothing. The door stayed shut, held fast by the tiny sliver of ironwood I'd hammered into the frame. He screamed, a high, thin sound of pure terror, and slammed his shoulder against the glass. "The door!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "Frank, the door is stuck." I didn't answer. I reached down and pulled the manual release I'd rigged for my own seatbelt. The jam he'd created was gone. bypassed by a simple length of heavy-duty fishing line I'd run through the casing. I sat back, perfectly still, as the SUV's front tires gripped the very edge of the gravel. I didn't let the car go over. I wasn't a murderer, even if he was. Just as the nose of the car began to dip into the fog, I reached over and yanked the emergency brake with every ounce of strength I had left in my old, weathered arms. Because of the adjustment I'd made, the rear wheels locked instantly, biting into the asphalt and swinging the back of the heavy vehicle around. The SUV skidded, tail whipping violently, and slammed sideways into a massive, ancient pine tree that stood like a sentry at the edge of the ravine. The impact was bone-shaking. Glass shattered, the passenger side window exploding into 1,000 glittering diamonds. The airbag deployed with a deafening boom, filling the cabin with acrid smoke and white dust. Then, silence. The SUV was tilted at a precarious 45-degree angle, the front tires spinning uselessly over the drop, held in place only by the sheer mass of the pine tree and the rear axle wedged against a rock. I was dazed, my shoulder throbbing where it had hit the door, but I was alive. Michael wasn't so lucky. His side of the car had taken the brunt of the hit against the tree. He was slumped against the steering wheel, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. The bravado, the calculations, the Florida dreams, they were all buried under a pile of twisted metal and broken glass. I pushed my door open. It groaned, the hinges screaming, but it gave way. I stepped out onto the damp, mossy ground, the mountain air filling my lungs like a tonic. I walked around the back of the car, my legs shaking, and looked through the driver's side window. Michael's eyes fluttered open. He looked at me, and for the first time, he didn't see a burden. He saw a man who had outbuilt him. "Frank," he wheezed, his hand clawing weakly at the glass. "Help me. The car. It's moving." He was right. The SUV was shifting, the weight of the engine block pulling it slowly, inch by inch, toward the ravine. The pine tree groaned, its roots straining against the rocky soil. "I told you, Michael," I said, my voice low and steady. "Wood never lies. You tried to build a life on a foundation of rot. This was always how it was going to end." "Please," he sobbed, the tears carving tracks through the dust on his face. "Sarah. Think of Sarah." "I am thinking of her," I replied. "I'm thinking of how she'll finally be free of the man who was stealing her future while he plotted to kill her father." I heard the sound of a car approaching, the dark sedan. It slowed to a crawl, its headlights cutting through the fog like the eyes of a deep-sea predator. My heart skipped a beat. Michael's associate. I reached into my pocket and gripped the small wood-carving knife I'd managed to slip into my coat earlier. The sedan stopped 20 feet away. A man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit that looked out of place in the wilderness. He wasn't holding a pipe. He was holding a leather briefcase. "Michael?" the man called out, his voice echoing in the mist. "You're late. My clients don't like waiting, and they certainly don't like finding their collateral hanging off a cliff." I realized then that this wasn't a hitman. This was the lender for Project Heron. This was the man Michael owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to, the man who was probably the real reason Michael was so desperate for my life insurance payout. "He's a little tied up at the moment," I called back, stepping into the light of the sedan's high beams. The man squinted at me. "Who are you?" "I'm the collateral," I said, "and I have something you might want to hear." I pulled the digital recorder from under the passenger seat of the wrecked SUV. I hit the play button. Michael's voice filled the air, distorted but clear, screaming about how I was a rotting piece of wood and how he was going to use the insurance money to flee to Florida. The man in the suit listened, his expression hardening into something cold and professional. He looked at the wrecked car, then at the man bleeding out inside it, and finally at me. "Mr. Salazar told us this was a sure thing," the man said quietly. "He told us the estate was being liquidated today. He failed to mention he was planning on skipping the country with our funds." "He's been failing to mention a lot of things," I said. At that moment, the pine tree gave a final, echoing crack. The SUV shifted another foot. Michael let out a terrified wail as the car tilted further, the front end now dangling completely over the dark void. "Frank, save me. I'll tell them everything. I'll give it all back." I looked at the man from the sedan. "He doesn't have anything to give back. He lost it all months ago. The only thing he has left is a debt he can't pay and a confession on this recorder. The man in the suit checked his watch. My clients have a very low tolerance for being lied to, especially when it involves fraud of this magnitude. He looked at Michael, then back at me. "What do you want, old man?" "I want my daughter back," I said, "and I want this monster out of our lives." The man nodded slowly. He reached into his coat, and for a second, I thought he was going to pull a gun. Instead, he pulled out a cell phone. "This is Elias," he said into the phone. "Cancel the Florida transfer. Our bird has crashed. And call the state police. Tell them we found a vehicle matching the description of the one involved in the Salazar embezzlement case. It looks like an attempted suicide." He looked at me and gave a curt, chilling nod. "We'll take it from here. You should go, Mr. Miller. Your daughter is waiting at the police station in town. I believe she received an anonymous tip about her husband's financial irregularities about 10 minutes ago." "Anonymous?" I asked. The man tilted his head toward the sedan. "My firm doesn't like losing money. We find that the police are very helpful in recovering assets when they're properly motivated." I didn't stay to see the rest. I turned and started walking down the mountain road, the fog swallowing the wreck and the man in the suit. I walked for 2 miles before a passing trucker picked me up. My body was screaming in pain, my mind a blur of grief and adrenaline. But one thought kept me moving. Sarah. When I walked into the police station 3 hours later, the first thing I saw was Sarah. She was sitting on a plastic chair, her face buried in her hands. When she looked up and saw me bloodied, bruised, but standing, she let out a cry that broke what was left of my heart. "Dad," she sobbed, throwing herself into my arms. They told me Michael stole everything. They said he was in an accident. They said you were with him." "I'm here, honey," I whispered, stroking her hair. "I'm here. It's over." But as the officers approached us, their faces grim, I realized it wasn't over. One of them held up a clear plastic bag. Inside was the brown notebook I'd found under the mattress. "Mr. Miller," the officer said, "we found this in your son-in-law's office during a search an hour ago. There are some entries in here that suggest this wasn't just a financial crime. We need to talk about what happened on that mountain." I looked at Sarah, and I saw the confusion in her eyes starting to turn into a terrifying, dawning realization. I realized then that the reversal I'd planned was only half the battle. Michael was gone, but the truth he'd left behind was a weapon that was about to destroy the only thing I had left, my daughter's trust. "Dad?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What is he talking about? What's in that notebook?" I looked at the recorder in my hand, the one that held Michael's final confession. I knew that once I played it, there would be no going back. Our old life was dead. But as I looked into Sarah's eyes, I saw the shadow of the man in the dark sedan, and I realized that Michael's associates weren't done with us yet. "Sit down, Sarah," I said, my voice heavy with 1,000 years of regret. "I need to tell you about the man you married, and I need to tell you what I did to save us." The fluorescent lights of the police station hummed with a sterile, biting intensity that made my head throb. Sarah was trembling in my arms, her breath coming in ragged hitches that felt like saws against my chest. I looked at the plastic bag the officer was holding, the brown notebook, the evidence of my own obsolescence. I knew that opening it in front of her was like inviting a storm into a glass house, but the time for protection was over. To save her, I had to let her break. Detective Vance, a man with a face like weathered granite and eyes that had seen too many family tragedies, motioned us into a small, windowless interview room. The air inside was stale, smelling of old coffee and the desperate sweat of 1,000 interrogated souls. He set the notebook on the table between us. "Mr. Miller," Vance said, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man of his stature. "We've had a preliminary look at this. It was found in a hidden compartment in your son-in-law's desk, along with these." He pulled out several other documents. Bank statements with red ink bleeding across the pages and a life insurance policy that had my name at the top and a $500,000 payout at the bottom. Sarah reached out, her fingers hovering over the insurance papers. "Dad, why is there a policy for $500,000? Michael said. He said it was just a small burial plan. He said it was for peace of mind. Peace of mind is one way to put it, honey, I said, my voice sounding older than I'd ever felt. But it wasn't your peace he was looking for. It was his own. I took the digital recorder out of my pocket. My hand was steady now. The adrenaline of the mountain still hummed in my veins, but it had settled into a cold, hard resolve. I looked at the detective, then at my daughter, whose eyes were wide with a fear I hoped she'd never have to feel again. Michael thought he was the architect of this family, I said. He thought I was just a scrap of wood he could toss into the fireplace to keep his own ambitions warm. But he forgot that I've spent my life studying the way things are put together, and the way they fall apart. I pressed play. The room filled with the sound of the wind howling through the mountain pass, followed by the roar of the SUV's engine. And then, Michael's voice. It wasn't the voice of the loving husband who brought Sarah flowers every Friday. It was the voice of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. You're dead anyway. By the time anyone finds that recorder you probably hid, I'll be halfway to Florida with Sarah. You think you're smart? You're just a rotting piece of wood, Frank. And today, I'm the one with the saw. The recording continued the sound of the struggle, the screech of tires, and finally, the sickening crunch of metal against the pine tree. When it ended, the silence in the room was deafening. Sarah didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just sat there, her face turning a ghostly shade of gray, staring at the small black device on the table as if it were a venomous snake. He tried to kill you, she whispered. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a world shattering. He was driving you to that ravine too. And I thought you were the one who was sick. I believed him, Dad. I looked at you and I thought your mind was going. I chose him over you. You didn't choose him over me, Sarah, I said, reaching across the table to grab her hand. It was ice cold. He gave you a map with the wrong directions. He spent months making sure you couldn't see the truth. That's not your fault. That's his sin. Detective Vance cleared his throat. We have units at the hospital. Michael survived the crash. He's got a fractured femur and some internal bruising, but he's conscious. He's already trying to tell the officers that you went crazy, Frank. That you grabbed the wheel and tried to drive both of you off the cliff in a murder-suicide. I felt a spark of that old, righteous anger. He's a man who lives by the ledger, Detective. He'll keep trying to balance the books in his favor until the day he dies. But the recording doesn't lie, and neither does his shadow ledger. Shadow ledger? Vance asked, leaning forward. I reached into the waistband of my trousers and pulled out the leather-bound journal I'd taken from the basement. I hadn't given it to the man in the sedan. I'd kept it for this very moment. I slid it across the table. Michael was careful, but he was arrogant, I explained. He kept a record of every cent he stole from Sarah's pension, every forged signature, and every payment he made to those associates. But there's something else in there. Something that I didn't get to read fully until I was waiting for the trucker to pick me up on the road. I flipped the journal to a page near the back. The ink was different here, older, more hurried. Michael didn't just target me because he was broke, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. He targeted me because I was the only one left who remembered the details of Mary's final days. Sarah's head snapped up. What does Mom have to do with this? She died of a stroke, Dad. The doctors said it was natural. I looked at the entry in the journal. It was dated a week before Mary passed. The old woman is suspicious. She saw the Boston papers I tried to burn. She knows about the trust fund discrepancy. If she tells Frank, the farm money stays locked away forever. The blood pressure medication. It's so easy to switch the labels. A spike in the night. A silent transition. Frank will be too buried in grief to ask for an autopsy. It's the only way to secure the foundation. The room seemed to tilt. Sarah let out a low, animalistic moan, her head dropping to the table. I felt a coldness settle into my bones that I knew would never truly leave. My Mary. My beautiful, sharp-witted Mary hadn't just died. She had been liquidated by the man we had welcomed into our home like a son. Detective, I said, my voice sounding like gravel. I want him charged with everything. Not just the fraud. Not just the attempted murder on the mountain. I want the grave of my wife reopened. I want the monster held accountable for the 8 years he stole from me. and the lifetime he stole from her. Vance took the journal, his face grim. If this holds up, Mr. Miller, he's never seeing the sun again without bars in front of it. But you need to know, Michael has friends. Or rather, people he owes money to. The kind of people who don't like their business being read in a police station. I thought of the man in the dark sedan, Elias. I thought of the way he'd looked at me, with a professional coldness that was even more terrifying than Michael's rage. They already tried to intimidate me, I said. They failed. They don't usually stop at one failure, Vance warned. For tonight, I'm putting you and your daughter in a safe house. We need to process the car and get a formal statement from Michael before his lawyers arrive and shut him up. As we were being led out of the station, the reality of the situation began to settle over us. I was 73 years old. My wife had been murdered. My son-in-law was a serial killer in a suit, and we were being hunted by a criminal syndicate. It was enough to make any man crumble. But as we stepped into the back of a police cruiser, I looked at Sarah. She wasn't trembling anymore. Her eyes had changed. They were hard, filled with a fire I'd only ever seen in Mary when she was defending something she loved. She looked at me, and for the first time in 3 years, I saw my daughter, the real Sarah, looking back. He's not going to get away with it, is he, Dad? She asked. No, honey, I said. He's not. But I didn't know then that Michael had one final move. Even from a hospital bed, even with his legs broken and his secrets exposed, he was a man who knew how to find the weak point in a structure. 3 hours later, at the safe house, a nondescript apartment on the north side of the city, the phone rang. Detective Vance's voice was tight with panic. Frank, where's Sarah? She's right here in the kitchen, Detective. Why? Get out of there. Now. Michael didn't just wake up. He talked. He told the hospital staff that Sarah was his accomplice. He said the whole plan, the insurance, the accident, was her idea. He's claiming he was the victim, and he's turned over a series of emails, sent from Sarah's account, detailing the entire plot. I looked at Sarah, who was pouring a cup of tea, her back to me. That's impossible, I whispered. She was with me. She was crying. She's his victim. The metadata doesn't lie, Frank, Vance said. The emails were sent over the last 6 months. From her laptop, at times when Michael was at work. He's dragging her down with him. If you don't leave now, the officers I sent to protect you are going to be arriving with handcuffs for your daughter. I hung up the phone, my heart stopping. I looked at Sarah. She turned around, a sweet, sad smile on her face, holding the tea. Who was that, Dad? I didn't answer. I heard the sirens in the distance, the low, rhythmic wail of the law coming to tear my family apart one last time. And then, I saw the small, glowing light of a hidden camera tucked into the smoke detector above our heads. Michael wasn't trying to escape. He was recording the fallout. He was making sure that if he went to hell, he was taking my daughter as his guest. And as the front door was kicked in, I realized that my revenge plan hadn't even begun. Because to beat a man who plays with numbers, you have to stop playing by the rules entirely. The world didn't end with a bang. It ended with the sound of my daughter's heart breaking for the second time in a single day. When the front door of that safe house groaned under the weight of a police ram, I didn't think about my age, my shaking hands, or the fact that my life was supposed to be in its twilight. I thought about the grain of the wood. I thought about how, when a structure is under too much pressure, you don't try to hold it up. You find the exit before it collapses on you. Sarah, move. Now, I screamed, grabbing her arm so hard I'm sure I left a bruise. She was frozen, the tea splashing onto her shoes. Her eyes locked on the smoke detector where that tiny, red camera lens glared back at us like a demonic eye. Michael was watching. Somewhere, from a sterile hospital bed, he was savoring this. He wasn't just a killer. He was a choreographer. He had calculated that if he couldn't have the insurance money, he would at least have the satisfaction of watching me lose the only person I had left. I didn't head for the front door. I knew Detective Vance's men would be swarming the hallway. I dragged Sarah toward the back of the apartment, into the small utility closet that housed the water heater. To a normal person, it was a dead end. To a man who had spent 40 years studying blueprints, it was a passage. Most of these old North Side apartments had shared ventilation shafts and service ladders for the plumbing. I kicked out the flimsy drywall behind the heater. I'd noticed it was a patch job when we arrived and pushed Sarah into the dark, dusty crawl space. "Dad, we can't run from the police," she sobbed, her voice muffled by the insulation. "If I run, it makes me look guilty. If you stay, you're a pawn in his game," I hissed, crawling in after her. "Michael has the digital evidence, Sarah. He's been sending those emails from your laptop for months. He probably used a remote access Trojan or scheduled them when you were in the shower. If you go into a cell now, you'll never come out. We need time. We need to find the how." We tumbled out of the service exit into a rain-slicked alleyway just as the first flashbang detonated inside the apartment above us. The sound echoed off the brick walls like a gunshot. I didn't look back. I led her through the labyrinth of alleys I'd known since I was a boy, my lungs burning, my 73-year-old knees screaming for mercy. I needed a ghost. I needed someone who didn't exist in Michael's world of ledgers and high-end scotch. I pulled out the burner phone I'd bought at a gas station on the way to the city, the one piece of technology Michael hadn't accounted for. I dialed a number I hadn't called in a decade. "Joe, it's Frank. I'm in the weeds, buddy. Deep." 20 minutes later, a rusted-out Chevy work truck pulled up to the curb of a shuttered laundromat. Joe Garcia was behind the wheel, looking exactly the same as the day he retired, covered in sawdust and smelling of cheap cigars. He didn't ask questions. He just opened the door. "Get in," Joe said, his eyes scanning the street. "David is waiting at the shop." David Evans was Joe's nephew. And as Joe had promised, he was a shark. But he wasn't the kind of shark that swam in the corporate waters Michael frequented. David worked out of a back office in an industrial park, defending the people the system liked to chew up and spit out. When we arrived, the smell of grease and old paper was a comfort. It felt real. It felt like a place where the truth could actually breathe. Sarah sat in a corner, wrapped in a moth-eaten blanket Joe had given her, staring into space. She was hollow. The man she had loved hadn't just betrayed her. He had attempted to erase her soul. "Here's the problem, Frank," David said, tossing a folder onto his desk. He'd spent the last hour on the phone with his contacts at the DA's office. Michael didn't just forge emails. He created a digital ghost. There are logs of Sarah searching for ways to tamper with brake lines. There are messages to a burner phone allegedly belonging to a hitman sent from her IP address. And the kicker? He's produced a secret recording of what he claims is Sarah talking about getting rid of the old man to save their marriage. "He's an accountant, not a sound engineer," I growled. "That recording is a fake." "It doesn't matter if it's a fake if it sounds like her," David replied. "In the eyes of a jury, metadata is the new gospel, and Michael is a high priest of data. He's already agreed to a plea deal. He'll take 10 years for the fraud if he testifies against Sarah for the attempted murder. He gets a shorter sentence. She gets life. He wins." I stood up, the rage inside me cooling into a hard, diamond-sharp focus. He wins because he's playing with numbers, but I'm a carpenter. I don't care about the numbers on the tape measure. I care about the tension in the wood. Michael thinks he's built a perfect box, but he's used green lumber. It's going to warp. "What are you thinking, Frank?" Joe asked. "Michael is a narcissist," I said. "He couldn't just frame her. He had to watch her fall. That camera in the safe house, that wasn't a police camera. Vance said he was sending men, but he never mentioned a feed. Michael installed that, which means he has a remote server, a place where all his trophies are kept." I looked at Sarah. "Honey, I need you to remember. Did Michael ever give you a gift? Something electronic? A digital frame? A new tablet? Anything that stayed plugged in?" Sarah blinked, her eyes slowly coming back to life. "He gave me a smart clock for our anniversary. It sits on my nightstand. He said it would help me sleep better with those white noise programs." My blood ran cold. A smart clock with a microphone and a camera. He's been recording our entire lives. Not just for the frame-up, but because he's a sick bastard who likes control. "If we can get that clock," David said, leaning forward, "and if we can prove he was accessing it remotely to harvest audio clips for his fake recording, we can blow his plea deal out of the water. But the police have the house cordoned off. It's a crime scene now." "The police have the front door," I said. They don't know about the crawl space behind the pantry. I built that house. Remember? I put in a hidden storage area for the silver Mary didn't want the burglars to find. It connects to the basement workshop. Frank, you can't go back there, Joe warned. They'll arrest you on sight for aiding a fugitive. They have to see me first, I replied. The plan was suicide, and I knew it. But as I looked at my daughter, her life hanging by a thread woven by a monster, I realized that being a nuisance was my greatest strength. Michael thought I was a fragile old man. He thought I was a liability. He was about to find out that a liability is just another word for a wrecking ball. We waited until 2 in the morning. Joe dropped me off 3 blocks away. The house was bathed in the eerie blue light of a single police cruiser parked at the curb. I could see the yellow crime scene tape fluttering in the wind, a plastic shroud over my life's work. I moved through the neighbor's yard, sticking to the shadows cast by the overgrown hedges. My heart was pounding, a rhythmic reminder of my own mortality, but my hands were steady. I reached the small, high window of the basement, the one Michael had watched me through just days ago. I'd loosened the latch months ago when I was fixing the dryer vent. I slid inside. The smell of the workshop hit me: cedar, linseed oil, and the cold, metallic scent of Michael's presence. I didn't turn on the lights. I used a small red lens flashlight, moving like a ghost through my own history. I climbed the service stairs, my joints popping with every step, and eased open the hidden panel behind the pantry. The house was silent, but it felt occupied. The air was thick with the residue of Michael's greed. I crept into the master bedroom. There it was on the nightstand, the sleek, black smart clock. Its screen was dim, showing the time in a mocking, glowing font: 1:14 a.m. I reached for it, but just as my fingers brushed the plastic casing, I heard a sound from the hallway. A floorboard creaked, a sound I knew intimately. I wondered if you'd show up, Frank. I froze. I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. The voice wasn't Michael's. It was lower, smoother, and infinitely more dangerous. It was Elias, the man in the dark sedan. The man Michael owed money to. "You're a hard man to kill, Mr. Miller," Elias said, stepping into the room. He wasn't wearing a suit this time. He was wearing tactical gear, and he had a silenced pistol pointed directly at my heart. "Michael is a mess. He's talking to the feds, trying to trade our names for a better sell. My clients find that inconvenient. If you're here to kill Michael, you're at the wrong house," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm here to clean up the mess," Elias replied. "Michael told us about the clock. He told us it was his insurance policy against us. He's been recording our meetings, Frank. He thought he could blackmail his way out of his debt." I realized then that Michael hadn't just framed Sarah. He had been playing a double game, recording his criminal associates using the same device he used to destroy my daughter. He wasn't just a monster. He was a fool who had tried to out-cheat the devil. "The police are outside," I warned. "The police are asleep in their car," Elias said, taking a step closer. "And by the time they wake up, this house will be an inferno. A tragic electrical fire. A grieving father and his fugitive daughter, lost in the flames. It's a clean ending." He raised the gun. I looked at the clock, then at the man who was about to end my story. I thought about the ironwood shim I still had in my pocket. I thought about the grain of the wood. And then, I did the only thing a carpenter could do when faced with a faulty structure. I didn't try to fix it. I brought the whole thing down. "You're right about one thing, Elias," I said, my hand closing around the heavy brass lamp on the nightstand. "It is a clean ending, but not for us." I didn't swing at him. I swung at the window. The glass shattered with a roar that echoed through the quiet suburban street. The police cruiser's lights snapped on instantly. I dived behind the heavy mahogany bed, the one I'd built to last a century, as Elias opened fire. The bullets thudded into the solid wood, a sound like a hammer hitting a nail, but they didn't penetrate. "Police, drop the weapon," a voice screamed from the lawn. Elias cursed, firing a final round toward the doorway before leaping through the shattered window into the night. I didn't wait to see if they caught him. I grabbed the smart clock, shoved it into my jacket, and scrambled back toward the pantry. But as I reached the hidden panel, I felt a sharp, burning sting in my side. I reached down, and my hand came away red. I'd been hit. I tumbled into the crawl space, the world starting to gray at the edges. I could hear the sirens now, a wall of sound closing in. I had the evidence. I had the truth. But as I slumped against the cool concrete of the basement floor, the clock ticking loudly in my ear, I realized I might not live to tell the story. I pulled out my burner phone and hit the only speed dial. "David," I wheezed, the copper taste of blood filling my mouth. "I have it. The clock, and Michael's friends. They were here. It's all on the recording. Frank, stay with me." I looked up at the workbench one last time. I saw the unfinished birdhouse I'd been making for Sarah's garden. It was imperfect. It had a knot in the roof, but it was mine. "Tell Sarah," I whispered as the basement door was kicked open by a dozen men in tactical gear. "Tell her the wood. It never lies." The darkness rushed in, but as the light faded, I saw the digital display on the clock. It wasn't showing the time anymore. It was uploading. To the cloud. To the police. To the world. Michael had built a cage, but he'd forgotten to lock the digital door. And as the hand of a medic pressed against my neck, I heard the final, mechanical voice of the smart clock, echoing in the empty workshop. "Upload complete. Broadcasting to all synchronized devices." I closed my eyes. The old man was finally costing Michael everything. The first thing I smelled was cedar. Not the fresh, sharp scent of my workshop, but a chemical, sterilized version of it, the smell of a hospital room trying to hide the scent of death. I opened my eyes, and the world was a blur of white and clinical blue. My side felt like it had been seared by a branding iron, a rhythmic throb that pulsed in time with the steady beep 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 of a heart monitor. "Dad?" I turned my head. My neck felt stiff, like a piece of unsteamed oak. Sarah was there, sitting by the bed. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in a single night. Her eyes were sunken, but the hollow, haunted look was gone. In its place was a fierce, protective light. She took my hand, the one that wasn't hooked up to an IV, and squeezed it. "Don't try to move," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "The bullet passed through the soft tissue. You lost a lot of blood, but the doctors say you're too stubborn to die. They called you a miracle of high-density bone structure." I managed a dry, raspy chuckle that turned into a cough. "I'm just a well-built cabinet, honey. Hard to break." "The clock, Dad," she said, leaning in close. "You did it. When it uploaded, it didn't just go to the police. Michael had a broadcast setting on his home automation system. He wanted to be able to access his files from anywhere, his office, his phone, his laptop. But because you triggered the emergency sync, the recordings went to every device linked to his account." A slow smile spread across my face. I could almost picture it. The police, the DA, the local news, even the digital billboards in his accounting firm's lobby. Sarah continued, a small, cold laugh escaping her. Everyone heard him. They heard him coaching himself on how to sound like me. They heard him laughing about how he'd erased Mom. And they heard Elias. The recording of the shooting in the bedroom. It's all there. The police picked up Elias and 2 of his associates at the airport 4 hours ago. "And Michael?" I asked. Sarah's expression hardened. "He's in the secure ward upstairs. He tried to claim he was under duress, that Elias made him do it. But then the second part of the upload hit the servers. The part you found in the hidden partition." I frowned. "The hidden partition?" "Michael was more arrogant than we knew," Sarah said. "He hadn't just recorded the crimes. He'd kept a video diary for his future memoirs. He thought he was a genius who would one day be celebrated for his vision. There's a video of him, 3 months ago, practicing your signature on the insurance papers. He looks directly at the camera and says, 'It's almost a shame. He was a decent carpenter, but a man's got to know when his time is up.' The weight of the betrayal was still heavy, but the sting was gone. It had been replaced by the satisfaction of a job well done. Michael had built his life on the idea that people were disposable, that a 73-year-old man was just an expense to be managed. He had been so focused on the profit margins that he'd forgotten to look at the structure itself. The recovery took months. I spent most of it in a wheelchair, which I hated, but it gave me time to watch Sarah. She was the one who handled the legal fallout. She worked with David Evans to ensure that every cent Michael had stolen was clawed back from the frozen assets of Project Heron. She didn't want the money for herself. She used it to set up a foundation in Mary's name, a scholarship for young women in trade schools. The most satisfying moment, however, didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in a small, windowless visiting room at the Cook County Jail, 6 months after the shooting. I'd insisted on going. Sarah didn't want me to, but I told her that a carpenter always inspects the final product. Michael sat across from me behind the glass. He was no longer the polished accountant. His hair was thinning, his skin a sallow, sickly yellow. He had a permanent limp from the crash, and his eyes were darting around the room, filled with a frantic, twitching fear. "Frank," he whispered, his voice cracking, "you have to help me. Sarah won't take my calls. Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her Elias's people, they're in here. They know I talked to the feds. I'm a dead man if I stay in General Pop." I looked at him, and I didn't feel rage. I didn't even feel pity. I felt the way I do when I see a piece of wood that's been so infested by termites that it's nothing but a shell. "You're an accountant, Michael," I said, my voice steady and calm. "You like numbers. So let's look at the math. You took 45 years of my marriage and turned it into a burial plot. You took 30 years of my daughter's life and tried to turn it into a prison sentence. And you took a $500,000 insurance policy on a man who wasn't ready to go." Michael pressed his hands against the glass. "I was desperate, Frank. The debt is paid," I interrupted. "But not by you. It was paid by the wood. You see, Michael, when you build a house, you have to use the right materials. You tried to build your life with lies, greed, and the blood of people who loved you. And the problem with a structure like that is that it only takes one solid piece, one old man who knows how to hold his ground to make the whole thing collapse." I leaned in closer, until my breath fogged the glass. "You're not a dead man because of Elias, Michael. You're a dead man because you're empty. There's nothing left of you but the record of your failures. And as for Sarah, she's not your wife anymore. She's the woman who's going to spend the rest of her life making sure your name is forgotten." I stood up and walked away. I didn't look back at him, not even when he started screaming my name, his voice echoing off the cold stone walls. When I stepped out of the jail, the sun was shining. It was a crisp, clear autumn day. Sarah was waiting for me in the truck. We drove back to the house, our house. The crime scene tape was gone. The shattered window had been replaced with a custom-built frame I'd made myself out of solid white oak. We walked into the backyard. The garden was thriving. The birdhouse I'd been working on was finally finished and mounted on a cedar post near the hydrangeas. A pair of bluebirds were already nesting in it. "It looks good, Dad," Sarah said, leaning her head on my shoulder. "It's solid," I replied. "It'll last." We sat on the back porch, drinking coffee and watching the sun dip below the trees. I realized then that my life wasn't in its twilight. It was just in a new season. I had lost Mary, yes, and I had nearly lost Sarah, but in the fire of Michael's betrayal, we had forged something stronger than anything he could have ever imagined. I still have a tremor in my hands. Some days, the wound in my side ached when the weather turned cold, but every morning, I go down to my workshop. I run my hands over the wood, feeling the grain, listening to what it has to tell me. People ask me how I survived. They ask me how an old man outmaneuvered a criminal mastermind and a syndicate of lenders. I tell them the same thing every time. I tell them that it doesn't matter how fast you can run or how much money you have in the bank. All that matters is what you're made of at the core. Michael thought I was a cost. He thought I was a liability. He thought I was a rotting piece of wood. But he forgot that the oldest trees are the ones with the deepest roots. And when the storm comes, those are the only ones that are still standing when the sky clears. I'm Frank Miller. I'm 73 years old, and I've learned that the most beautiful thing you can ever build isn't a mahogany wardrobe or a dining table. It's the truth. Because once the truth is out in the light, no matter how much it hurts, it's the only thing that can never be broken. I looked at Sarah, who was laughing at something on her phone, finally free of the ghost of the man who tried to steal her life. I picked up a piece of sandpaper and started on a new project, a cradle for the grandchild Sarah had told me was coming in the spring. I'm going to build it out of ironwood. Because some things are meant to last forever.